I was,
Right. That's what we're here for. I see how the relationship is.
town spines don't.
Now, are your children back to school?
They started today too.
They started to. Now, where is that?
Yeah.
We found out from
Foxboro was yesterday. Pawtucket was last week.
Yeah. It's warm out today. It's supposed to be pretty brutal tomorrow.
I hope so.
It's going to calm down a bit.
Which will be fine with me. They keep going down, they're going down, yeah.
So, how is everybody doing today? Need a whistle or something.
Hang on something.
Hang on something. Yeah, it's all right. It's the back row. It's always the back row that's causing trouble.
Whistle.
How is everybody doing today?
Great.
We're ready to get going.
Yes.
All right. So, it's good to be back here in Foxboro. A little advertisement. I'm going to be speaking at the Historical Society on the 25th of this month. So we're at the library.
Oh, okay.
So, watch your news feeds or whatever.
Do you have any more schedules here?
I don't know. I got to check with the new management to see what we're doing here.
Well,
Speaking on the library?
I'm going to be speaking at the library
No, what?
on King Philip's War.
oh.
So,
Is it in the evening?
it is, I believe, at 6:30.
7:30, 7
Seven-
o'clock.
What's
Sorry,
that?
7 o'clock.
7 o'clock. Somebody from the Historical Society bailed me out. I have it on my calendar, but
Yeah.
I'll be
You
there
can
at
get there
6:30.
You can get there at 6:30.
That's when they start serving cocktails.
They'll be there.
In any case,
Is that Philip?
no, it's a different, it's King Philip's War, the Native American War in the 17th century. So today, this afternoon, whatever it is, we are going to be looking at some American history. Last week we talked about the Medici and Florence and the Renaissance, so this fits right in with that, right? No. Today we're looking at a talk I've titled The Creation of the American Century. Now, in American history and kind of world history, the 20th century is often referred to as the American century. Why? It's because you really have the global emergence of the United States as an economic, an industrial, a military power. So what we're going to look at this afternoon is kind of how that happened. What were the events that drew the United States away from a kind of self-imposed isolationism? We liked being way over here across the Atlantic Ocean, into being one of the key players in a global network. So the creation of the American century, the global emergence of the U.S. from 1890 to 1919. Now 1890 is kind of a rounded number, a rounded date. Could really go back to 1865, the end of the Civil War, if we wanted to, and talk about the emergence of the United States as an industrial power. During that period, from the end of the Civil War to the early decades of the 20th century, the United States was growing tremendously in terms of industrial capacity, in terms of economic power, in terms of population. There was natural population increase, but there was also great waves of immigration, people coming from Southern and Eastern Europe to the United States. So we see, in many ways, during that time period, the creation of modern American society. Many aspects of things that we deal with today emerged during that time period. This past weekend, Monday, we had a holiday. What holiday was it?
Labor Day.
Labor Day. Where does Labor Day come from?
Labor.
Labor, exactly. It comes from basically the struggles of the working classes and the institution of things like paid sick leave and weekends off and 8-hour workdays, that sort of thing. All of that begins to emerge in the United States in that period after the Civil War, the Second Industrial Revolution, if we want to call it that, and the emergence of the American labor movement. So you have a lot of internal dynamics going on in the United States in those decades after the Civil War. The development of essentially a modern American economy, the rise of people like J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie. What's that?
No.
The guy with the oil, Rockefeller. You know, big names like that who become titans of industry, who also have tremendous political power because of their wealth. And as a reaction to that growth of industry, you begin to see the labor movement, you begin to see the progressive age appearing, where we have government intervening in how businesses are run, government regulating aspects of the relationship between labor and industry. In any case, it is during that period that the United States really begins to emerge to the forefront of the global economy. Prior to the Civil War, we were a largely agrarian country. We were mostly farmers. We had cities, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, but the bulk of the population lived in the countryside, spent their time growing and harvesting. In 1860, right before the Civil War starts, the largest economic product of the United States was cotton. Cotton dominated the economy. It accounted for something like 60% of our exports. That changes by the time we get to the dawn of the 20th century. We surpass Britain, Germany, France as the leading industrial power on the planet. So that ties in with this idea of the creation of the American century. And we pick up our story with a presidential election. Why not, right? The election of 1896. The election of 1896 saw two prominent candidates vying for the presidency. The Democrats nominate the voice of the progressive movement in the United States at that time, William Jennings Bryan. Bryan was a gifted orator, well renowned for his voice, for his presence when speaking to crowds. He traveled extensively across the country by train, speaking to millions of people in his quest to win the presidency. The Republicans nominate William McKinley. McKinley stayed at home for the entire campaign season, ran what was called a front porch campaign. His supporters came to him and he would talk to them from his front porch, from his rocking chair. Two different campaign styles. Yet, as the cover of Puck magazine over here shows, what happened? You have Bryan over here talking, and you have McKinley gaining weight, gaining the status. When the American people go to the polls in 1896, who wins?
McKinley.
Is it paid to stay home, right? You didn't even have to put in the effort. As we see, McKinley wins 51% of the popular vote, some 7.1 million votes to Bryan's 6.5 million votes. 600,000 votes separating them. It's a substantial number at that time. In the Electoral College, McKinley wins 271 to Bryan's 176 votes. So McKinley wins the presidency in 1896. Kind of as an aside, what was the main issue in 1896, the main political issue? You wouldn't. It was gold standard versus silver standard, essentially. What should the backing of U.S. currency be? Should it be gold or should it be a mixed gold and silver standard? Bryan supported the silver. McKinley, the conservative candidate, supported gold. McKinley ends up winning and in 1897 becomes president of the United States.
Good
So-
shot.
Eventually,
Yeah,
he does.
eventually.
You've given away the ending. So McKinley becomes president in 1897. Now, McKinley's presidency happens to coincide, or his election happens to coincide with an economic recession in the United States. In 1893, the economy that had been booming stalls. You have the panic of 1893. Banks are closing, railroad companies are going bankrupt, a housing bubble emerges. There was too much credit extended, and everything is collapsing. The Panic of 1893 was the largest economic downturn in American history to that point. So McKinley comes into office in the midst of this economic upheaval. And what happens? Well, the economy begins to turn around. Suddenly, banks are being reestablished. The railroad financing is kind of cleaned up, and the railroads are put on a sound footing. There is available credit. Farmers are planting again, and things look good. McKinley gets a lot of credit for ending that Panic of 1893. How much he actually did, it's kind of tough to say, because those things are kind of cyclical. But he gets credit for this booming economy. While things are getting better economically here at home, the American public is also keeping an eye on events on an island not too far off the shore, the island of Cuba. Cuba, in the 1890s, was still part of the Spanish Empire. You know, that Spanish Empire that Christopher Columbus helped establish in 1492, that for a long time dominated all of Central and South America, except for Brazil. During the reign of Philip II, King of Spain, the Spanish Empire stretched around the world, from the Philippines. Who were the Philippines named after? Philip, King of Spain. Through the Americas, all the way across Europe. The Spanish Empire was this mighty, powerful, wealthy state. Yet, by the 1890s, it was a shadow of its former self. Many of its colonial possessions, all of Central and South America, had gained their independence. But the Spanish still held on to the Philippines and still held on to Cuba and a couple of other islands scattered around the world. Well, what happens? The Cubans, in the beginning of the 1870s, begin a series of wars against the Spanish rulers to establish Cuban independence. There are really 3 wars of independence for the Cubans. They are all, the first 2 are brutally suppressed. Spain doesn't want to let go of its colonies, so they are putting tremendous pressure on these Cuban revolutionaries. Finally, in 1895, the Cuban War of Independence breaks out. Cuban revolutionaries again attacking the Spanish, trying to kick the Spanish out of the island, and the Spanish crown, Spanish royal government, trying to put down this revolution. The revolution was marked with scenes of intense violence, massacres on both sides. The Spanish opened concentration camps on the island of Cuba to put Cuban revolutionaries in. There is starvation and execution and all sorts of things. And we here in the United States are very concerned about what's going on the island of Cuba. Why? Well, it's really close. And, you know, we're kind of concerned about the Cubans, right? We're like, oh, the Spanish shouldn't be doing that to them. But we also are very closely tied to Cuba financially. A lot of American corporations had invested millions and millions of dollars in Cuba, particularly some of the fruit companies and the sugar companies here in the United States. They had facilities on the island of Cuba, and political turmoil on the island was not good for business. So the American government, the American corporations are very closely watching what's going on the island. And there is a growing public outcry here in the United States that we, as Americans, have a moral duty to step in to help the Cubans. Here are a couple of cartoons from the time period. Here is kind of a picture of what some people would envision happening on the island of Cuba. You have the frying pan of Spanish misrule. And what happens if you jump out of the frying pan in Cuba? You end up in the fire of anarchy. Which is worse? Well, the United States wanted to prevent that descent into anarchy. So we begin to look at it as a mission for the United States to protect the damsel of Cuba over here. In many cases, in many ways, the United States saw that it needed to intervene on the island of Cuba to protect the interests of the Cubans. And also, it was good for business. So we are watching very closely all of this turmoil going on the island of Cuba. McKinley becomes president in 1897, and he's watching what's going on in Cuba. There are newspapers in the United States run by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer that are beating the drums for war. It comes to be called yellow journalism. But McKinley doesn't want to get involved in the war. He doesn't want to go to war with Spain. He's dealing with the economy. He's kind of, Cuba's a secondary issue. But eventually, enough noise is made in the press and by business leaders that get McKinley's ear, that convince him he needs to at least make a show of the United States' interest in the island of Cuba. So McKinley gets permission from the Spanish government to send an American warship to Havana, kind of as a symbol of American presence, a symbol of American stability. So in February of 1898, the USS Maine is sent into Havana Harbor. Actually, what we see there is the Maine at anchor in Havana Harbor. This is the fortress guarding the entrance of the harbor. Well, what happens to the Maine? It blows up. On the night of February 14th, February 15th, 1898, the Maine explodes. Nearly 300 American sailors are killed in the explosion of the Maine. Almost immediately, what do the newspapers in the United States, Pulitzer and Hearst, who do they blame? The Spanish did it. There's immediate public outcry blaming Spain for the destruction of the Maine. The Spanish, for their part, say we had nothing to do with that. That wasn't us. But there is growing public sentiment in the United States that Spain is responsible. The Navy sends a commission to examine what happened to the Maine. The commission report is pretty inconclusive. They couldn't determine how the Maine had blown up, why it had blown up. But there is growing public sentiment in this country for war. Spain must be punished. Remember the Maine. Eventually, enough pressure is put on McKinley that he goes to Congress and asks for a declaration of war against Spain. And what emerges from that is the Spanish-American War. In terms of actual fighting, the Spanish-American War was a relatively minor conflict. It was about 10 weeks of combat, and most of that was in the early part of the war. You have the Battle of Manila Bay. The Philippines are brought into this. The Battle of Manila Bay, the American Pacific Squadron shows up in Manila in the Philippines and basically blows up the Spanish fleet that's at anchor there, because the Spanish in the Philippines didn't get word that the war had started yet. So we had an advantage on them. Interestingly, while this was going on, the Philippines were in the midst of a revolution against the Spanish. They wanted to gain their own independence from Spain. So Spain was dealing with a revolution in Cuba. They were dealing with a revolution in the Philippines. And we managed to take advantage of both of those. So we send a fleet into the Philippines, destroy the Spanish fleet there, as we see illustrated right here, in early May. Then, by June, we begin landing on the island of Cuba. Here we see the American troops landing at Daiquiri. Daiquiri is actually a city, it's not just a tropical drink. So American forces land at Daiquiri, they land at Guantanamo Bay and begin moving across the island of Cuba. And eventually, after basically a couple of weeks of combat, what happens? Spain sues for peace. They ask for peace. Their military was disorganized, it was antiquated, their navy was largely destroyed at Manila and at the Battle of Santiago Bay in Cuba. Spain couldn't fight. So they sue for peace. They ask for peace. And the United States is happy to give Spain peace. We signed a treaty in Paris in December of that year, officially ending the Spanish-American War. Now that Treaty of Paris is hugely significant in American history, because what does it do?
Gives us the Philippines.
It gives us the Philippines. It gives us Puerto Rico. We acquire some other islands in the Pacific, and Cuba is granted independence. One of the reasons we go to war with Spain is to help Cuba gain its independence. So here we kind of see a political cartoon of the time period, a rather fierce-looking Uncle Sam and a rather stereotypical-looking Spaniard over here. Uncle Sam making the plea, the demand for peace and gaining Cuba, Puerto Rico, other islands, as it says there. The Spaniard has no recourse, has to accept it, and the American flag is being raised all over the place. Yay! And Cuba is independent. Sort of. Right? Because Spain is gone, the Cubans are happy that the Spanish are gone, but now
Stuck with us.
we're there. The United States says, well, we're just going to stay here until Cuba can write a constitution and get itself organized as a civil government and that sort of thing, which takes several years. Finally, in 1903, a Cuban constitution is written. Well, by 1901, that Cuban constitution is written, but the United States isn't really happy with it yet, because we kind of like having Cuba. We like that we have these ports in the Caribbean. We like that we can control the certain aspects of Cuban government. So Cuba's independent, but we still want to have our fingers in it. So in 1903, the Platt Amendment is added to the Cuban Constitution. Now, Platt was a congressman from the United States. I think he was from Ohio, I could be wrong. But he basically writes this document that says Cuba can be independent, but the United States kind of gets veto power on all the stuff they want to do. So part of the Platt Amendment says that the government of Cuba shall never enter into any treaty or other compact with any foreign power or powers which will impair or tend to impair the independence of Cuba. So Cuba's independent, but you can't make alliances with anybody or enter into partnerships with anybody. The government of Cuba consents that the United States may exercise the right to intervene for the preservation of Cuban independence, the maintenance of a government adequate for the protection of life, property, and individual liberty. So Cuba's independent, but the United States can come in at any time for the protection of those things. And that to enable the United States to maintain the independence of Cuba, to protect the people thereof, as well as for its own defense, the government of Cuba will sell or lease to the United States lands necessary for coaling or naval stations. So, anybody ever wondered why we still have a naval base at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba? But it has to do with this. It goes back to the Cuban War of Independence, the Spanish-American War, and the Platt Amendment. We have that naval base there because we kind of wrote the document that allowed us to do so here. Eventually, Cuba is coerced into accepting the Platt Amendment. It does become a part of their constitution, and the United States, for the next 3 decades or so, reserves the right to meddle in Cuban affairs as we see fit. So, Cuba Libre, sort of.
Yeah.
Anybody know what Cuba Libre means?
Free
Cuba. Independent Cuba, free Cuba. It's also a tasty drink. It's a rum and Coke. It's a rum and Coke with a wedge of lime. Cuba Libre.
Is it good?
It's rum and Coke. Well, it depends on how you feel about both of those. At the same time that we are fighting the Spanish-American War and acquiring these territories stretching across the globe, we are becoming more deeply involved in Hawaii. Hawaii had been an independent kingdom. The British explorer, Cook, finds the Hawaiian Islands. Of course, people were living there, but he finds the Hawaiian Islands in the 1770s. He actually ends up being killed on the Hawaiian Islands. And it eventually establishes itself as a recognized independent kingdom. Eventually, that kingdom is overthrown in the 1890s, and a Hawaiian Republic is established. Now, why is the Hawaiian kingdom overthrown?
Missionaries?
What's that?
Missionaries?
Not missionaries, although the missionaries were kind of a pain in the butt.
Yeah.
What was that?
The wealthy planters.
Wealthy planters, particularly American wealthy planters, the fruit companies. How many of you have ever had Dole pineapples?
Oh, yeah.
Well, the Dole family, the Dole Corporation, was very much involved in the overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom. Many of those fruit companies and sugar companies, American sugar companies that had invested in Hawaii, were beginning to feel threatened. They were beginning to feel threatened by a growing Japanese influence in Hawaii. The Japanese were starting to invest on the islands, and the last queen of Hawaii was kind of allowing that to happen, which the American investors didn't like. So what do the Doles do? But they essentially foment a revolution, forcing the last Hawaiian queen, whose name I can't think of right now, Lily Kuleane or something like that,
Long name.
to abdicate. A Hawaiian republic is established. Of course, Dole, Sanford Dole, hopes that the United States will immediately annex Hawaii. But Grover Cleveland says, I don't want to do that. That's kind of a, Where's the legitimacy of that? So Hawaii, for a short time, is an independent republic. Well, as we delve into the Spanish-American War, as we get deeper into this conflict, it suddenly becomes apparent to McKinley, to the administration, that we should grab Hawaii. We should make Hawaii part of the United States. Why? Well, now we own the Philippines. So Hawaii is kind of on the way to the Philippines. It makes sense. We already have corporations established there. So in 1898, Hawaii is annexed. It becomes a territory of the United States. This is still a touchy subject for many native Hawaiians. In any case, what you see is the raising of the American flag above the Royal Palace in Honolulu. And again, the good editors at Puck with an appropriate cartoon, kind of the shotgun wedding of Hawaii and Uncle Sam being officiated by William McKinley over there, while the press and the fruit corporations over here are making sure nobody runs away from the altar. So in 1898, the United States acquires Hawaii as part of this growing international presence.
They didn't do anything to the Queen, though, did you, when they?
I think she goes into exile, but I don't remember what her fate actually is.
Yeah, they didn't.
She doesn't get killed, I believe.
Or imprisoned or anything.
I don't think so,
Okay.
but I think she is forced to leave Hawaii.
Yeah.
So in 1898, we win the Spanish-American War, acquire the Philippines, a bunch of islands in the Caribbean, have our fingers very deeply involved in Cuba, and now we have Hawaii. Well, what does all of that mean? It means that by the dawn of the new century, by 1900, the United States has a global empire. We have gotten into the game that the British and the French and the Germans and even the Italians had been playing for much of the 19th century, conquering territory and bringing it under our wings. Literally in the case of the eagle over there on the right.
Would you call
The United
us
States,
imperialists?
what's that?
Would you call us imperialists?
It was a form of imperialism. Now, imperialism kind of has dirty connotations in the United States. We view ourselves as a republic in that we do things for noble reasons. Yet, what we see going on here between 1898 and the early 20th century is essentially trying to get in line with what the Europeans have been doing for the better part of a century. We need to acquire territory across the globe. We need to have these. Why? As a way of showing our greatness, as a way of showing our power, our economic might, and our military might. So we acquire this global empire. This one here, this magazine cover, it's called Columbia's Easter Bonnet. Columbia here is a stand-in for the United States. And if you look at her Easter bonnet, what shape is it? Like a battleship. And on it, it says world power. And then out of the smokestack, you have the feather of expansion. That was seen as the destiny of Western states during that time period. All of the great powers had to expand, had to have colonies. That was viewed as a means to greatness. So the United States participated in that, in establishing this empire. Here again, you see the American eagle, one wing on the Philippines, the other over here onto the Caribbean, casting the American shadow. In addition to all of this, of course, the United States had for a long time been messing around in Latin America. In 1823, President Monroe issues what comes to be called the Monroe Doctrine. And what does the Monroe Doctrine say? Well, you have it to the test. Everybody's heard of the Monroe Doctrine.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, says that.
But what does it say?
I don't know.
Basically says the Western Hemisphere, the Americas, are no longer subject to the interference of other states. They are the United States' backyard. We're the only ones who can mess around in the Americas. Now, the Monroe Doctrine was issued because many of those Latin American countries had gained their independence. Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela. Brazil was Portuguese and remained a Portuguese, part of the Portuguese Empire until much later. So we deal with Brazil a little bit differently than we do with the other ones. But they had gained their independence from Spain. So the United States decides, unilaterally, that we will protect the independence of the Americas. European states are not allowed to meddle here. So this shadow of the American eagle should also go southward. In fact, it kind of does over here. You see Panama right in the middle. So what do we see? We see this tremendous growth of American territory, American power. In addition to that, we are not only acquiring territory, but we are beginning to deal with many of those Western European imperial powers and imposing our will in other parts of the world. And this brings us to Asia and the interactions between Western powers and China. China, of course, was an ancient empire. There's 5,000 years of Chinese history. Yet by the latter part of the 19th century, the Chinese state was fragile. The Chinese emperors were losing power. They couldn't maintain control of their own country. They couldn't create peace in their own country. And though China had closed itself off from the West for centuries, after the Opium Wars of the 1830s and 1840s, Western powers begin to penetrate into China. What you see over here are kind of the great powers fighting over the corpse of the Chinese dragon. So you have Russia and Britain and Italy and Austria and Germany. The rooster always represents France, and even Japan, which by this time had modernized and westernized. And back here in the background, who's that guy? The bald eagle wearing a top hat. Very stylish. Is the United States. So China was seen as the next great area for Western incursion, for Western influence to spread. The Chinese had closed themselves off. Now they couldn't defend themselves. In 1899, the United States, the McKinley administration, creates what comes to be called the open door policy. The open door policy basically said that China should be open for anybody to trade in. Any of the Western powers, we can go into China and essentially do what we want and go where we want. So it's the United States that creates this open door policy, but you know, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, to a smaller degree, Japan, all say that's a great idea. So the United States unlocks the door and allows all these other states in. Now, who was not involved in creating the open door policy? China. The Chinese didn't necessarily want all of these Westerners coming through their countries, into their country. But China, the Chinese government, the emperor, the Dowager Empress, who really was the power in China at that time, couldn't stop this from happening. So you begin to see deep Western incursion into China with this open door policy. Yet there was tremendous resentment against this. The common Chinese had a strong dislike for the Westerners, particularly Western missionaries. Western missionaries who are penetrating deep into the countryside and bringing foreign religious ideas into China. Foreign ideas that undermined the traditional structures of Chinese society were seen as particularly dangerous. And as a reaction to this Western incursion, groups begin to spring up. One group was called the Society of the Harmonious Fist. They were a radical quasi-religious sect who practiced an extreme form of martial arts. They practiced a martial arts that they believed made them impervious to Western bullets. They could not be killed by bullets fired from foreign guns. They were imbued with this deep, deep belief in this deep faith. Now, of course, that sort of faith can be very, very powerful. And what happens? But this group that the Westerners call the Boxers, because of their martial arts, begin to try to purge China of the Western influence. They go and they attack isolated mission outposts. They burn diplomatic outposts. They murder Westerners who are on the roads in China. It gets to the point where the German ambassador to China is assassinated by the Boxers. Now, all of these kind of smaller incidents do make their way back, the news of those do make their way back to the West, and they do cause some concern. But the assassination of the German ambassador provokes a reaction. Of course, Germany at that time was led by a very level-headed and calm individual, Kaiser Wilhelm. Not at all calm or level-headed. And he demanded immediate revenge on the Chinese, or for the assassination of the German ambassador. But the Chinese government was really powerless to do anything, and the Empress didn't necessarily want to stop the Boxers because they were attacking the Westerners, who she wanted to get out of China also. So the Boxer movement begins to grow, begins to expand. More adherents begin to follow and attack isolated Westerners. It gets to such a fever pitch that the diplomatic legation, the diplomatic area in Beijing, Peking at that time, right outside the imperial city, is besieged by the Boxers. It is a dire situation for those Western diplomats and Western merchants and missionaries in China. Well, what happens? The Western powers decide we need to intervene in China, we need to put down this rebellion. So a 9-nation coalition is established. And these countries go and they send their ships and they send their troops to China to put down this Boxer rebellion. Here, this is a great photo because it shows you the various groups that were involved in putting down the Boxer rebellion. British, American, Russian, British Indian, German, French, I don't remember where that guy's from, Italian and Japanese, all combined to go and put down the Boxer rebellion. When these multinational force arrives in China, basically each country got their own section of China that they had to subdue. They went up the rivers on gunboats and troops went ashore, and eventually all of the armies converge on the cities in China, Tientsin and eventually Peking. Here you see American troops storming the walls of Peking, climbing and sticking the American flag up at the top. So the multinational force does eventually suppress the Boxer rebellion, does eventually crush this rebellion. The end of the Boxer rebellion essentially spells the death knell of imperial China. Within a decade, there will be a revolution in China that overthrows the monarchy and establishes a Chinese republic. But this is significant because the United States is considered one of those great powers, plays a large role in putting down this Boxer rebellion. And in fact, American troops are for a short time stationed in China. I always find these images really interesting, particularly this one right here. You have American soldiers camping out in the imperial city in China, the Forbidden City. Think of the experiences of some of those guys. Imagine you are a farm boy from Iowa, and you're in the army, and all of a sudden you're in Peking, you know, a city that has been there for thousands of years and is unlike anything you've ever seen. It truly must have been shocking, a culture shock and surprising. So here's a political poster or a propaganda image from the time showing William McKinley wielding his sword and a rifle-bearing Uncle Sam carrying the American flag and putting down the barbarous Boxers right there with heads on pikes and stuff like that. So the United States is involved in this multinational effort to put down the Boxer Rebellion, and we succeed in that. Now, while this is going on, we have another political cycle here in the United States. 1900 is a presidential election year, and William McKinley runs for re-election. Now McKinley, things are going pretty well. The economy has rebounded. He victoriously led the nation into the Spanish-American War. We've now become a global empire. For his vice president, McKinley decides to dump the first guy you had, whose name I can't even remember, and pick a hero of that Spanish-American War. Teddy Roosevelt is chosen by McKinley to be his vice presidential running mate. Now the story behind that's a little bit more complex. Teddy Roosevelt comes back from the Spanish-American War, is elected governor of New York State. The problem that with Roosevelt was that he was a reformer. He wanted to clean up New York State government. And the political bosses in New York didn't like that. That was a danger to them. So Roosevelt has all this energy, all this passion and this fame. He wants to clean up New York State. Well, McKinley runs for re-election, and the political bosses in New York say, I know what we can do. I know how we can get rid of Teddy Roosevelt. We'll make him the vice president. Nobody will ever hear from him again. So he becomes the vice presidential nominee, essentially to get him out of the hair of the New York State political machine. But he does have that star quality, that hero quality from the Spanish-American War. And we see here this campaign poster from the McKinley-Roosevelt campaign. In 1896, this is what the country was like. Factories closing, run on the banks, Spanish rule in Cuba, people imprisoned there. By 1900, after 4 years of McKinley, prosperous farms and cities, people going to the bank to deposit money, and American rule in Cuba, prosperous farms and happy people. So running on this platform of domestic prosperity and international success, McKinley becomes the Republican nominee. Who do the Democrats nominate in 1900? William Jennings Bryan, once again. He loses 3 times. Well, I gave it away. Who wins? McKinley. McKinley is reelected. Teddy Roosevelt becomes vice president. Those New York politicians are so smart. They got rid of him.
Wasn't that Tammany Hall that they?
Tammany Hall was the name of it was actually the Democratic political machine in New York.
Yeah, but weren't they crooked though?
Oh, very crooked. All the political machines were crooked.
Well, they still are, but I mean.
No, it's just that
Okay. So McKinley is reelected president. We are winning this thing, we're involved in the Boxer Rebellion, suppressing that. Things are going well. In the fall, really about this time of year, in 1901, there was a World's Fair held in Buffalo, New York. It was called the Pan American Exposition. And it was meant to celebrate the glories of the Americans. The president goes to Buffalo in September of 1901 to be present at this event. Imagine people going to Buffalo voluntarily. And the president is standing in the Hall of Music and he's shaking hands with well-wishers. A long line of people who want to shake the president's hand and say, "Nice to meet you, Mr. President. Doing a great job, Mr. President," that sort of thing. Well, in that line was an anarchist who just wanted to kill somebody important. And he has his opportunity in Buffalo. As he is in line approaching the president, his hand is wrapped in what looks to be a bandage. And when he gets the president, McKinley extends his hand to shake. He extends that bandaged hand, which has a pistol in it, and shoots the president. McKinley is shot in the stomach and mortally wounded. Dies later on that day, the next day, 2:15 a.m. With the death of McKinley,
Mrs. McKinley's okay.
Teddy steps in.
Teddy Roosevelt becomes the next president of the United States. Now, Teddy Roosevelt is really one of the more extraordinary figures we've had as president. A man who overcame childhood illness and almost obsessive depression to become one of the most energetic and forceful presidents we've had. He ushers the United States into the 20th century. He pushes the continued presence of the United States as a global power. He was not afraid to use American military muscle to get his point of view across, to solve international dilemmas. He really is a kind of a watershed figure in the story of the American presidency. Because while he was pursuing these international agendas, he was also very progressive on his domestic agenda. The Food and Drug Act that made sure that we didn't have tainted food or drugs is passed under Teddy Roosevelt. He begins the process of creating national parks using the Antiquities Act to set aside land for conservation. He gives birth to the modern environmental conservation movement by bringing in experts and scientists and politicians to study the public lands of the United States to decide which should be saved, which should be put aside. So he does all of these things in addition to taking care of the monopolies, fighting against the monopolies and trying to rein in the power of the large corporations. So Teddy Roosevelt comes in with this vision that it is the destiny of the United States to be the next great country, to be the one with the power. And he has some things he has to take care of. One of the big issues facing the United States is that now we are an international power. We have possessions in the Pacific, we have possessions in the Atlantic. We have navies in both of those oceans. But how do you get from the Atlantic to the Pacific? You got to sail all the way around. It's a long way. So Teddy Roosevelt says, you know, why don't we maybe a shortcut. Why don't we try to get across the skinny part of the Americas? Now, this idea of building a canal across Central America had been around for a while. The early Spanish conquistadors envisioned a waterway connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific. In the late 19th century, the French had tried to do so. They tried to build this canal. They failed miserably. That was a tremendous financial failure for the French. But we're the United States. We can do what those other people couldn't. And sure enough, we begin seriously thinking about how to build this canal, where to build this canal. One of the problems we encountered, however, is that the country of Colombia, which controlled much of southern Central America, didn't want to allow us to build a canal. Colombia had no interest in helping the United States do this. So, what do?
Do it anyway.
Well, we do it anyway, but we do it by encouraging the inhabitants of the northern part of Colombia, this place called Panama, to declare their independence and revolt from Colombia itself. In 1903, this Panamanian revolt begins. The United States says, "Yay, we support you. We recognize you as an independent country." And in exchange, the government of Panama says, "Hey, you want to build a canal?" So in 1903, begin work on what would be one of the great engineering projects of the 20th century, the Panama Canal. Now, this project would take 10, 11 years to complete. The building of the canal itself was a tremendous undertaking. Have any of you been to the Panama Canal?
No.
Impressive? Yes.
Unbelievable.
Engineering-wise,
And it's not protected.
it's not.
It's so wide open.
It's a waterway, right? It's just a connection. In any case, Teddy Roosevelt says, "Okay, let's go ahead. We'll start building the canal." Now, of course, Congress hadn't given him the okay to do this, but he's kind of pushed ahead with it anyway. And as you see here, Teddy Roosevelt digging that canal right through the isthmus of Panama, dumping shovelfuls of dirt on Bogota there in Colombia, saying, "Haha, we win." He begins this massive undertaking to, ostensibly for the benefit of the United States. It was going to be a military waterway to allow our navies to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific, but it was also going to be for trade. It was cutting down the time that it took to go from New York to San Francisco by months, because you cut right across the middle. You didn't have to sail all the way around South America. Teddy Roosevelt actually goes to Panama to visit the canal zone. That's him right there in the white suit. He becomes the first sitting American president to leave the country when he does that. So the Panama Canal, an important aspect of Teddy Roosevelt's vision for the United States and our growing status in the world.
Paulo, were we the only ones that paid for the canal? The United States?
Yes. And eventually we do have the arrangement with Panama that they will get the canal back,
After
which
100
is
years.
who owns it now.
They do.
They do, exactly.
But our taxes paid for?
100 years ago, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it did have tremendous economic benefit for the
Oh,
United
yeah.
States also. So we build the Panama Canal, begin building the Panama Canal. At the same time, Teddy Roosevelt in 1904 issues what comes to be known as the Roosevelt Corollary. Now, how many of you took science classes in high school?
Oh, all of us.
What is a corollary? It's like an addendum. It's an add-on to something. The Roosevelt Corollary is essentially an add-on to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine says that the Western Hemisphere is our backyard. We're the only ones allowed to meddle there. The Roosevelt Corollary kind of strengthens that idea. It says, chronic wrongdoing may, in America, as elsewhere, ultimately require intervention by some civilized nation. It's an important phrase right there.
Yeah.
And in the Western Hemisphere, the adherence of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence to the exercise of an international police power. Basically, if a country in the Americas is misbehaving for any reason, we, as the United States, reserve the right to go and intervene in that country, as we see over here in the cartoon. Now, the reason Roosevelt issues the Monroe the corollary here is because the Republic of Santo Domingo had defaulted on some loans to European countries. And those European countries were thinking of armed invasion to recover those loans. And Teddy Roosevelt says, that's our job. You're not welcome here. We're the ones who will do that. So here you see Teddy Roosevelt. Apparently he liked to dress like a Rough Rider all the time. Pointing the big gun of the Monroe Doctrine at the kings of Europe. So it was meant to ensure and protect American interests in the Western Hemisphere. We are the only ones who can intervene in various places. Of course, if you look at the long history of the United States relationship with Latin America, what do we do? A lot. We get involved in the internal affairs of many, many, many Latin American countries. I think we'll talk about another one later on. So essentially, what the Roosevelt Corollary says is that we go to big stick diplomacy, and we are the big stick in the Caribbean. Here's Teddy Roosevelt with all his little toy boats behind it. So Roosevelt famously says, speak softly, but always carry a big stick. This was the implementation of that idea of the big stick. We're the ones who have the power in this part of the world. Britain, France, you other countries, stay out of it. Interestingly, France still has territory in the New World, in the Americas. French Guiana and the island of Martinique are both part of France. They never gained independence from France.
What was Peru then? Who owned
Peru was Spanish.
Yeah.
That was part of kind of the independence movement of many of the Latin American countries in the early part of the 19th
Yeah.
century.
But Brazil's the.
Brazil was Portuguese.
Portuguese.
Yes.
And then the Dutch have that little island where everybody,
Yeah, the Dutch held on to a couple of the islands involved with trade. So, you know, you have the, like St. Martin and the Virgin Islands is a Dutch island.
England has the.
England has a couple.
They-
The important part of the Monroe Doctrine.
Bermuda in it. No, they have the.
Go ahead.
Aruba was another island.
Aruba is another, who has, that's Dutch too, right?
Dutch.
Yeah, that's Dutch.
But they
So
own the islands
they
of-
all had, many of those European countries had island possessions. If they were already there, there was nothing we could do about it.
Right.
But what the Monroe Doctrine basically said is, we're not going to allow you to come back into places that have gained their independence. We're the only ones who can do that. So we have the big stick. Now, the United States is growing in importance, certainly. And how do we really see that? We're involved in China. We're leading the way in some of the efforts in China. But we also become peacemakers. In 1904, the Russian Empire and the Japanese Empire go to war. The Russo-Japanese War. They go to war over some territory in the Far East. The war goes very badly for the Russians. And eventually, they sue for peace. Well, who is brought in to mediate between Russia and Japan? The United States. Teddy Roosevelt essentially brings representatives of the Russian Empire and the Japanese Empire to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And there in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, they hammer out the Treaty of Portsmouth, which ends the Russo-Japanese War. Teddy Roosevelt with the Tsar and the Emperor there. Both of those guys look really happy. Now, for his efforts in ending the Russo-Japanese War, Teddy Roosevelt wins the Nobel Peace Prize. He's the first American president to win that prize.
Is that a long war?
It was about, not very long, it was a couple of months.
That's it.
Yeah, it's disastrous for Russia.
Yeah.
In fact, as a result of this, there's a pre-revolution revolution in Russia, a revolution of 1905, which weakens the power of the Tsar somewhat.
Okay.
So we have involved ourselves in international affairs. We're in China, kind of leading Western efforts in China. We are involved in protecting the Americas from foreign incursion. We're solving world problems here. Roosevelt, however, was also very much a believer in naval power. He wanted the United States to have tremendous naval strength. So he begins a massive naval armaments building project. And by 1907, he decides we need to show off this new fleet, to show our military power. So he sends the Great White Fleet around the world. The United States naval squadrons are sent around the globe, making stops in various countries. Now, there were a couple of reasons why this fleet was sent. One, ostensibly to show goodwill from the United States. We're going to pay visits to all these harbors and bring gifts to the rulers and that sort of thing. It was also to show off American military might. look, we had this brand new Navy, all of these powerful battleships. But on a more practical level, it was also meant as a training exercise. Here you have new crews on new ships. How better to learn how your ships operate than by sending it around the world? So there were many reasons why Teddy Roosevelt sends this fleet around the world. But as you can see, it goes South America, the West Coast, New Zealand, Australia, up here to Japan, through to India, through the Suez Canal, into the Mediterranean, and back across the Atlantic.
How many ships on the fleet?
I don't remember the number of fleets, ships. It was the Atlantic Squadron that went. So it was basically half the Navy that was sent on this around the world journey. So the United States is emerging and really being recognized as one of the great powers now. We are right there at the forefront. We are leading the way. But we are still dealing with events closer to home. In 1916, the United States invades Mexico. Why would we do that? How many of you have heard of Pancho Villa? Oh, Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa was a Mexican revolutionary. He was one of several revolutionaries fighting for political goals in Mexico itself. You had Pancho Villa in the north, you had the Zapatistas in the south. The Mexican government was very unstable. It was almost like an oligarchy at the time. So you had all of this upheaval in Mexico. Well, Pancho Villa happened to be in northern Mexico, which meant that when Mexican troops were pursuing him, what did he often do? He came across the border to the United States. Sometimes he and his men would raid towns in the United States to look for weapons or money, to look for trains that had guns in them. You know, the United States was a place where there was a bounty for Pancho Villa to raid. So he was constantly coming across the border. In Mexico, some people viewed him as a hero, some people viewed him as a villain. In the United States, he was viewed as an outlaw. So he's coming across the border, attacking United States towns, going back. Eventually, in 1916, he attacks the town of Columbus, New Mexico, and burns the town to the ground. That required a response. So this so-called border war had been going on between the United States and Mexico for about 6 years at that point. Well, Columbus, New Mexico is burned. The American government says that's unacceptable, and we send an army expedition into Mexico. That expedition was headed by General John Pershing. How many of you know that name? World War I. He leads the American Expeditionary Force in World War I. So Pershing and his troops go into Mexico trying to pursue and capture Pancho Villa. A couple of cartoons from the time period. One of the junior officers, a lieutenant, who went into Mexico with Pershing on this expedition was a guy named Patton. He gets famous later on. In any case, in the United States, it was viewed as Uncle Sam going and punishing the brigands in Mexico. Pancho Villa there, depicted as a stereotypical barefooted and sombrero-wearing Mexican. Or as the pit of vipers over here that Pershing is stomping on. Well, what actually happens in this American intervention in Mexico? We don't catch Villa. We spend about a year, less than a year, marching around in northern Mexico, engaging in a couple of small fights with some of Villa's followers, but in January of 1917, the American forces come back into the United States. Pancho Villa is still running around in Mexico. His stature is, of course, growing in Mexico at this point because he's evaded American forces in that country. So we have this event going on. Now, why didn't we stay in Mexico? Well, there were big events going on in Europe, weren't there? 1914, World War I breaks out. Now, at first, the United States remained neutral in that war. The American public did not want to get involved in the First World War. We wanted to stay out of it. Let Europe stew in its own juices. Let Europe destroy itself. But eventually, after repeated provocations by the Germans, the United States is moving closer and closer and closer to war. In 1915, the Lusitania is sunk. American lives are lost. In 1916, a German saboteur attack in Jersey City, New Jersey, blows up an armaments depot. In 1917, it's revealed that the German ambassador to, the German foreign minister had written to the ambassador in Mexico, trying to entice Mexico to wage war against the United States. That was really the last straw. In April of 1917, the United States declares war on Germany. So we go from being a neutral into being involved in the war itself. For the next 20 months or so, the United States troops would fight in France. Now at first, there was only a handful of American troops going to France. We didn't have an army, a large peacetime army. We had to build the army. It really isn't until early 1918 that large numbers of American troops are showing up on the battlefields of France. But the presence of those American troops did tip the balance of the war in favor of the Allies. And by November of 1918, Germany and Austria and the Ottoman Empire asked for an armistice. They asked for peace. On November 11th, 1918, the armistice is formally signed. The fighting in the First World War comes to an end. But the armistice was just a ceasefire. To formally end the war, a peace treaty had to be signed. So, the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, makes the transatlantic journey to France to participate in the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. When Wilson shows up in Paris, he is greeted as a hero, as a savior. The streets are lined. An estimated 3 million people show up in Paris to see him. Paris had a population of less than 2 million at the time. There are signs and flags all along the streets of Paris. As I said, he's greeted as a conquering hero. Little girls are flinging flower petals in front of him as he walks. I'd imagine it did a lot to stroke his ego. I know when people have those giant banners of me, it's very pleasant. I get a kick when I see my name on the sign in front of me. So Wilson becomes one of the big four, one of the four architects of the peace treaty that ends the First World War, the Versailles Treaty. He is now sitting at the big boy table with Britain, France, and Italy. They are the ones crafting the peace treaty. Of course, the Treaty of Versailles is highly flawed. It breeds German resentment, it breeds political instability, and eventually leads to the Second World War 20 years later. But at the time, it was seen as this tremendous accomplishment. It ended the war to end all wars. But it doesn't end American involvement in military endeavors at this point, because in 1918, the United States actually intervenes in Russia. In 1918, as the Russian Empire is collapsing and the Russian Revolution is flaring up, and it looks like the Bolsheviks are about to gain control of Russia, the Allies, in a move of desperation, decide to send troops into Russia to try to counter the Bolshevik growth and to get Russia back into the war. One of the things the Soviets do when they take power in Russia is they pull Russia out of the First World War, which was not good for the Western Allies. So, in order to kind of tip the balance back, in 1918, an American expeditionary force is sent into Siberia. Here you see them in Vladivostok. And another force is sent to Murmansk and Archangel, above the Arctic Circle. That's this one. And it comes to be called the Polar Bear Expedition. There should actually be another quotation mark over here. But those two American military endeavors were meant to essentially counter the balance of the Bolsheviks and ostensibly meant to protect the material investments that the Western Allies had made in Russia. When Russia was our ally, ammunition, weapons, railroad cars had been sent there as part of the war effort. Now, these Allied troops are sent to protect those interests. In both of these endeavors, it was a pretty miserable experience for the American troops there, particularly the Polar Bear Expedition, because Archangel and Murmansk, as I said, are above the Arctic Circle. And by October, it was wintertime there, the harbor froze in. The ships could not leave, the men were essentially stranded there. Vladivostok wasn't as bad a situation, but still, you had American troops who were stranded there for a while because the harbor froze iced in. when you finally had the summer thaw in 1919, ships were sent to take the polar bear expedition away from Murmansk and Archangel. Most of those troops were from Minnesota, I believe, so there's a monument to the polar bear expedition up in Minnesota. The troops in Vladivostok and in other parts of Siberia stayed there a little bit longer until 1920, when they were replaced by Japanese troops who came in to fill those positions. But even after the First World War, the United States was involved in these interventions in Russia, of all places. Now, from 1919, 1920, the United States really emerges as the leading power on the globe. Europe was largely physically destroyed and economically destroyed by the chaos of the First World War. The United States remained largely unblemished. European nations, the French, the Russians, the British, had lost essentially a generation of young men on the battlefields. The United States casualties were terrible, 300,000 men, but not as catastrophic as they were in Europe. So at the end of the First World War, the United States emerged in a position of unparalleled greatness. We had the economy, we had the military power, we had the global position. But what happens in the 1920s and 1930s? Depression and isolationism. We begin to dismantle the military we had built. There was a long-standing tradition of distrust of standing armies in the United States. We begin to kind of pull away from the international body. The United States never enters the League of Nations, the international body that was actually created by Woodrow Wilson. We never joined that. And led to a weakness of the League of Nations that perhaps was one of the causes that led to the Second World War. Now, what happens in Europe in the 1930s? You see the rise of dictators, people like Mussolini and Stalin and Hitler. And that eventually leads to a greater, more destructive conflict in Europe that the United States once again is hesitant to get into, but eventually does. And the presence of the United States in many ways does tip the balance of that war. In the aftermath of the Second World War, we begin to see a new idea of internationalism in the United States, in the government, and we become involved in many aspects of attempting peacekeeping and maintaining our global position. So really, the birth of the American century, the emergence of the United States as a global power in the early 20th century, kind of comes about through all of these events that we looked at, through our involvement in overseas military efforts, in diplomatic efforts, and in working in conjunction with some of the other great powers at that time. Any questions? Yes?
Where we regained the Philippines,
Yes.
Hawaii, and Cuba, was that common? I mean, how important was the military in international trade?
In international trade, navies have always played a large role in international trade because much of the trade was carried by sea.
Yeah.
So, you know, Britain in the 19th century had this tremendous trading empire that was backed by the might of the British Navy. In the late 19th century, an American admiral, Alfred Mahan, writes a book that's called The Impact of Sea Power on History. And it was a highly influential work that said all of the great powers, all of the great empires had powerful navies, and having a powerful navy allowed them to expand, allowed them to conquer territory, and allowed for economic benefit for the country. So military outposts do play a role in economic growth. If you have, you know, banana fields on an island in the Philippines, I don't know if bananas grow in the Philippines, so how do you protect that from, say, the Japanese who are also wanting to expand their interest? Having a military presence there is very, very significant. We can kind of see echoes of that playing out in the South China Sea today, right? China is building artificial islands and, you know, putting military bases there. Why? To extend their range, to extend their influence. They're getting closer to the Philippines. They're putting pressure on Japan. A lot of that is military, a lot of that is economic, a lot of it is just territorial expansion. So it's all kind of wrapped up into a giant ball of global network politics.
How did we, Paula, how did we get Puerto Rico when Was that just a bonus when?
Puerto Rico was, we also fought on Puerto Rico during the Spanish-American War. It was another Spanish colony.
Well,
And it was one of the things that was kind of thrown along in the Treaty of
Because
Paris.
they didn't sue for independence from Spain, did they?
No, there were probably some insurgent movements on Puerto Rico, but it wasn't the focus like Cuba
We
was.
just got it as a,
It was, I mean, we basically controlled it with our Navy at that point anyway.
right,
Spain couldn't hang on to it, especially after they lost Cuba.
right.
And that brings up kind of the interesting status of Puerto Rico today,
That's territory.
right? So,
Yeah.
But when we
Do you-
acquired Hawaii,
yes.
when we acquired Hawaii, was that an act of aggression?
It was not an act of outward aggression by the United States because the monarchy of Hawaii had already been overthrown several years earlier.
Okay.
It was just kind of a, at that point, almost a natural extension of American influence and power. One thing I didn't talk about here is that the Philippines, though we acquire them in the Treaty of Paris after the Spanish-American War, the Filipinos themselves had been involved in that war against the Spanish to get independence. They weren't necessarily happy being under the control of the United States. And in the early part of the 20th century, American forces were sent to the Philippines to fight against Filipino rebels. One of the Filipinos, a guy named Emiliano Aguinaldo, who was a revolutionary leader against the Spanish, we use as an ally during the American invasion of the Philippines in the Spanish-American War, because he already had a structure in place there, but then he becomes our enemy fighting against the Americans after the Spanish are defeated. Fascinating history of the Philippines themselves.
Yeah, do you think the average American had access to all those wonderful cartoons and drawings and paintings at
Today?
that point in time then,
Then.
to determine their thinking politically?
The average American, if they had access to newspapers and magazines, did see a lot of those images. The cartoons in particular, as we saw, some of them were from Puck magazine. A lot of those were published in pamphlet form. A lot of them did appear in newspapers. One of the tools that Pulitzer and Hearst used to kind of get the public riled up for war with Spain was the political cartoon. They had a way of kind of condensing vast thoughts into simple images and swaying public opinion in that way. If you want to kind of have a modern parallel, if you're on Facebook or Twitter and somebody posts a meme, it's kind of the same idea, right? It could show a political opinion there and maybe you go, oh yeah, I agree with that, or oh, I don't agree with that. So it's you know, the tools of convincing the public of one view or another have been around for a very, very long time. And each generation finds new ways of tweaking that. So yes, people would have seen many of those images along the way.
You know, it was also during that time that we acquired quite a bit of land too, in Alaska.
Alaska was a little bit earlier. It was 1867 when we buy Alaska. Alaska had been Russian property. And Secretary of State William Seward arranges for the purchase of Alaska from the Russians in 1867. Of course, people thought, this is stupid, why are we buying Alaska? There's nothing there but ice. It was called Seward's Folly, exactly. But eventually, Alaska, you know, we find out Alaska has some stuff in it. Alaska is actually, as you know, and muchly discussed to people in Texas, Alaska is the biggest state in the Union. And it's, if you look at the territory of Alaska and kind of superimpose it over the 48 continental, it's about a third the size of the rest of the country. It's gigantic.
When you showed the, at the beginning, when you showed the voting for McKinley and the brown states that were territories.
Those were territories.
The brown things were territories. Were
Yes.
they allowed to vote?
You can vote, but your vote didn't count.
Not
It's
at
kind
all?
of like,
Well, they were part of the
let's look at
college.
Puerto Rico today, right? Puerto
Yeah.
Rico, citizens, people that live there are American citizens. But because Puerto Rico is not a state, it doesn't have any electoral votes.
Yeah, they
Okay.
can't vote for president.
Well, if they have residency in one of the states, they can file votes. So if you are, you say you live in most of the time in Puerto Rico, but you have residency in Connecticut, you can vote absentee ballot in Connecticut because you are a citizen. But as a territory, Puerto Rico does not have a voice. They have a non-voting member of Congress, and like American Samoa does, and some of the islands out in the Pacific, and they don't have an electoral vote for president.
What years were the railroads developed, and who was president then?
The earliest railroads that we see being built in the United States are really in the 1820s, and they were really short tracks. In the 1830s, the B&O Railroad was begun, which went from Baltimore, connecting it was heading out toward the Ohio River Valley.
Well, I was thinking like across the country.
The Transcontinental Railroad is completed in 1867, the late 1860s. That's what connects east and west. By that time, however, there were rail networks throughout particularly in the Northeast, but also a few going down into the South. We don't see the railroads going west until after the Civil War.
What did Canada think about the Alaska acquisition?
What did Canada, they were probably not real happy, but you have to remember at that point, Canada was still part of the British Empire. So it was a British possession, a British territory. And because the British were imperialists, and that was Russian, the Russians were free to do whatever they wanted with it. So I can't imagine that the British were very happy with that event happening, but you also have to consider how much did the British actually care about the far northwestern part of Canada. All right, well, thanks a lot.
Thank you.